At 6:47 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on March 14, 2024, a timestamp reconciliation error propagated through the centralized transaction processing infrastructure shared by Walmart, Target, and Kroger, three retail giants collectively responsible for approximately 64% of American grocery distribution. The root cause was traced to a routine update in the SAP Retail Enterprise Resource Planning, or ERP system, specifically within the Inventory Synchronization module that cross-references Universal Product Codes, or UPCs, with real-time pricing databases. The update introduced a millisecond-level discrepancy in how the system validated transaction timestamps against inventory audit logs, a seemingly trivial deviation that cascaded into what engineers would later classify as a global skew mismatch event. Within 17 minutes, over 11,400 retail locations found their point-of-sale terminals locked in perpetual verification loops, displaying error code ERRSYNC timeout 0x492C on checkout screens nationwide. The systems were designed with a fundamental assumption that cloud-based inventory verification would always be available, always accurate, and always faster than human intervention. When that assumption failed, the entire transactional architecture collapsed into a state that no fail-safe had anticipated, a condition where products physically existed on shelves, but existed nowhere in the digital ledger that governed their sale.
Retail automation engineers had, for decades, maintained theoretical offline mode capabilities in POS infrastructure, emergency protocols designed to allow cash-only transactions during network outages, with manual inventory reconciliation performed later. However, three critical developments in the 2020-2023 period had rendered these systems functionally extinct. First, the elimination of cash register override keys in 89% of automated checkout lanes, replaced by biometric manager authentication that itself required cloud validation. Second, the integration of dynamic pricing algorithms that adjusted costs based on real-time demand analytics, weather patterns, and competitor monitoring, systems that had no concept of a fixed price that could be charged during network failure. Third, and most catastrophically, the legal and insurance frameworks that now governed retail operations explicitly prohibited manual sales without simultaneous digital inventory deduction, as such transactions created unreconcilable gaps in tax reporting systems and loss prevention databases. When managers at a Kroger location in Columbus, Ohio attempted to process transactions using paper receipts and calculators, the store's automated liability monitoring system, a separate cloud service running parallel to the POS network, flagged the activity as potential shrinkage event and triggered an automatic lockdown of the pharmacy section, preventing the dispensing of prescription medications without electronic verification, a decision that would have fatal consequences within hours.
The retail supply chain in 2024 operated on a principle known as perpetual inventory synchronization, wherein automated distribution centers received picking and packing instructions not from human dispatch, but from predictive algorithms analyzing sales velocity data in real time. When the POS systems entered their locked state, they ceased transmitting transaction data to the upstream logistics network. From the perspective of the automated warehouse management systems, WMS, used by companies like C&S Wholesale Grocers and McLean Company, the invisible giants that actually move food from distribution centers to store loading docks, the sudden silence was interpreted as a complete cessation of demand. Sophisticated algorithms, trained to optimize for efficiency and minimize waste, made the rational decision to halt outbound shipments to stores that appeared to have stopped selling inventory. By 11 a.m., over 2,100 refrigerated trucks scheduled for delivery to affected stores had been automatically rerouted back to regional distribution centers. The compounding tragedy was that stores were simultaneously full of product but unable to sell it, while the replenishment system had concluded that no replenishment was needed. Warehouse workers in automated facilities reported that the robotic picking systems, massive ASRS installations valued at $40 to $80 million per facility, had entered standby mode, their neural network controllers waiting for demand signals that would not come. The food was there, the trucks were there, the fuel was there, but the digital handshake that authorized movement had been severed. Surveillance footage from the first hours reveals a phenomenon that would later be termed proximity desperation, the psychological state of being separated from necessary resources by only a physical barrier and a bureaucratic protocol. At a Target in Phoenix, Arizona, customers gathered around the locked self-checkout kiosks at 8:15 a.m., their shopping carts full of groceries for which they could not pay. Store employees, most of whom were hourly workers with no technical training in database architecture, could only repeat the message they'd received via internal communication systems. The registers are down. We cannot process any transactions. We don't know when they'll be back up. What made this different from a simple power outage or credit card network failure was that the products remained scannable. The barcode readers worked, the weight sensors worked, the security cameras worked, but the final step of sale authorization hung indefinitely on verification screens. Parents with infant formula in their carts, diabetics with insulin prescriptions waiting at pharmacy counters, elderly customers with their weekly groceries, all were told to wait or to leave empty-handed. By 10 a.m., corporate social media teams were receiving thousands of complaints per minute, but the technical support infrastructure had no solution to offer because the problem existed at the architectural level of the retail operating system itself. The store managers had no override codes, the district managers had no manual workarounds, the vice presidents of operations were on emergency conference calls with SAP engineers in Waldorf, Germany, trying to understand why a timestamp validation routine had become a single point of failure for the American food supply. The first confirmed fatality occurred at 11:42 a.m. in a Walmart supercenter in Tampa, Florida. A 67-year-old male with a history of atrial fibrillation had arrived to pick up his prescription for Eliquis, an anticoagulant he had been taking for 4 years. The pharmacy's inventory management system, which was integrated with the same ERP infrastructure experiencing the global desync, refused to dispense the medication without completing a transaction in the POS system. The pharmacist, bound by both corporate protocol and state pharmaceutical regulations that required electronic logging of controlled substance dispensations, could not legally hand over the medication without the computer system recording the exchange. The patient, who had missed his previous dose due to the ongoing system outage, suffered a stroke in the parking lot 17 minutes later and was pronounced dead at 12:33 p.m. This pattern repeated across the nation with variations in medication type and medical emergency classification. The Centers for Disease Control's Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report would later document 142 fatalities in the first 24-hour period, with 89 directly attributable to medication access failures at retail pharmacy locations. The remaining 53 deaths were classified as civil disturbance-related, including altercations between customers and store security, crowd crush incidents at stores that attempted to open their doors despite non-functional registers, and 3 fatalities from a vehicular incident at a looting event in Detroit. The pharmaceutical lockout was particularly cruel because the medications existed, were prescribed, were paid for by insurance, and were physically present in the pharmacy's refrigerated storage, but the software would not release them. At 1:30 p.m., the General Counsel offices of the 3 affected retail chains convened in a joint emergency teleconference to discuss a question that seemed absurd in its simplicity. Could they authorize employees to give away food for free until the systems were restored? The answer, delivered by a team of corporate attorneys and tax compliance specialists, was legally and financially complex. First, the corporations were bound by Sarbanes-Oxley financial reporting requirements that mandated accurate inventory accounting. Distributing inventory without recording the transaction would create a reportable internal control deficiency that could trigger SEC investigations and potentially criminal liability for executives. Second, the company's insurance policies for general liability and product liability explicitly excluded coverage for incidents involving products distributed outside normal transactional protocols, meaning that if someone became ill from food given away during the outage, the company could face uninsured litigation. Third, and most absurdly, the automated tax calculation systems that generated real-time sales tax reports to state revenue departments were themselves dependent on the same failed POS infrastructure, meaning that even free distribution would require sales tax calculation at $0 that the system could not perform.
The legal department's conclusion was that the safest course of action from a corporate liability perspective was to keep the stores closed until the technical issue was resolved. This decision was communicated to store managers at 2:15 p.m. via an internal alert system, along with instructions to contact local law enforcement if customers became aggressive or non-compliant with the closure order.
At the SAP Crisis Response Center, a team of database engineers worked through what would become a 31-hour continuous shift to diagnose the failure. The problem resided in a seemingly innocuous section of code within the real-time inventory valuation module, specifically in the function that synchronized transaction timestamps between the POS front-end and the ERP back-end. Modern retail systems operate on the principle of eventual consistency, where multiple database replicas exist across geographically distributed data centers and changes propagate through the network with millisecond-level precision. The March 14th update had modified the timestamp validation logic to be more strict, implementing a maximum allowable drift of 50 milliseconds between transaction initiation and inventory deduction. However, during peak morning shopping hours, network latency between store POS terminals and the centralized ERP database, routed through multiple content delivery networks and cloud service providers, regularly exceeded 200 milliseconds. The system entered a logic loop: reject the transaction because the timestamp is out of sync, but retry the transaction immediately using the same timestamp, which is now even more out of sync. The retry mechanism, designed to handle transient network failures, became a perpetual failure generator. The engineer's solution required a complete rollback of the update and a forced resynchronization of all inventory databases, a process that would take 14 hours to execute safely without risking data corruption. During those 14 hours, the American retail food system would remain in a state of digital paralysis. By 4 p.m., the failure had propagated beyond the grocery sector into interconnected systems that depended on retail transaction data. Financial institutions that provided short-term credit facilities to the retailers, lines of credit based on daily sales velocity, began receiving automated alerts that their borrowers had experienced a sudden and complete cessation of revenue. Algorithmic trading systems, which monitored real-time retail sales data as an economic indicator, interpreted the data gap as a catastrophic demand collapse and initiated sell orders on retail sector stocks, triggering a 7% decline in the S&P retail ETF within 90 minutes. Payment processors like Visa and MasterCard, whose networks were functioning normally but receiving 0 transaction requests from 3 of America's largest retailers, escalated the anomaly to the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, under the assumption that a coordinated cyber attack was in progress. The electrical grid operators, whose demand forecasting models incorporated retail activity patterns, began preparing for an unexpected evening load drop, not realizing that the consumption hadn't decreased, only the ability to measure it had failed. The interdependency was total and invisible. A database timeout in a retail ERP system had become a multi-sector infrastructure event because every system had been optimized for efficiency and integration, with no consideration for the possibility that the integration itself could become the failure point. The final casualty report, compiled by a joint task force of the CDC, FEMA, and the Department of Commerce, revealed the anatomy of systemic brittleness. Of the 142 fatalities, 89 were pharmacy-related, as previously noted, but the remaining 53 revealed a darker pattern of societal fragility. 11 deaths occurred in what the report classified as resource competition events, altercations over the last available supplies at stores that had briefly attempted to operate with manual cash-only systems before corporate shutdown orders arrived. 14 deaths were attributed to medical supply chain interruption, including diabetics unable to purchase glucose monitoring supplies and individuals dependent on over-the-counter medications for chronic conditions. 9 deaths were classified as law enforcement intervention incidents, occurring during the dispersal of crowds that had gathered outside closed stores, including 3 fatalities from a crowd crush when police attempted to clear a Walmart entrance in Milwaukee. The remaining 19 deaths formed a category the report termed systemic stress acceleration. Individuals who were already in fragile health and for whom the added stress of the crisis, combined with disrupted medication schedules and inability to access food, triggered fatal cardiac events or other acute medical emergencies. The report's conclusion was stark. The American population had become so dependent on the seamless functioning of retail automation that a 24-hour interruption of the digital interface to the physical supply chain had a measurable mortality impact, even though the actual food and medicine supply remained physically intact throughout the crisis. The systems were restored at 8:47 p.m. on March 15th, 38 hours after the initial failure. Stores reopened at 6 a.m. on March 16th to crowds that had been waiting overnight. The immediate crisis passed. SAP issued a technical postmortem explaining the timestamp synchronization error and the corrective measures implemented. Retail executives testified before congressional committees about the need for better system redundancy. Technology columnists wrote about the fragility of just-in-time everything. But the fundamental architecture remained unchanged. The POS systems still required cloud connectivity. The inventory systems still operated on real-time synchronization. The legal frameworks still prohibited manual transactions. The insurance policies still excluded coverage for off-system distribution. Within 6 months, the average consumer had forgotten the event entirely, remembering it only as that day the grocery stores were closed. The retail engineers, however, understood what had been revealed, that the entire American food distribution system was now dependent on the continuous, flawless operation of database timestamp validation routines, and that there was no backup plan that didn't violate corporate legal liability frameworks. They had built a system that was extraordinarily efficient in normal operation and completely helpless in abnormal conditions. The groceries had stayed on the shelf not because of scarcity, not because of logistics failure, not because of economic collapse, but because a clock was wrong by 150 milliseconds, and nobody had the legal authority to override the machines that had noticed.